It's a little bad right now. Hopefully not too much nose blowing. Okay, so tell me when are we
Sparta! 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 Inhale through nose. Keep your eyes closed. Send in your way back. Sit and relax. Breathe a little bit down. Enjoy the show. Wave in motions of the spine. Drink a glass wine.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's Sparta session. Our guest is Elvia Wilk and she's going to talk about a book that will be published next year, which is called Death by Landscape, and she'll present an adaptation of an essay which is called This Compost, the Erotics of Rot, and I think that sounds quite promising.
Hi,
Hey,
hi.
Elvia.
Where are you at actually? Right now?
I'm in Brooklyn. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. First step accomplished. Yes, I'm in Brooklyn. And I'm super grateful for the invitation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, as usual, we will have a Q&A session after the lecture, and the link will be in the video or underneath in the comments below. Okay, so you can start now.
Okay, so as mentioned, I'm going to give a talk that is based on an essay from this collection that's coming out next year. I'm just going to show a lot of pictures and go on some tangents probably, but it should be about 45 minutes, just to let you know. As an image description, right now I am sitting in a white room with a plant hanging above me, and I am a white woman giving a PowerPoint presentation, and unfortunately I can't give image descriptions of every slide, but if anybody would need them, I would be super happy to provide the slides to accompany the talk later. Just get in touch. So this is called This Compost, Erotics of Rot. Drunk birds. At some point in the early 2010s, variations of a pop science news story about birds began to circulate online. Study says pollution makes birds gay, or gay by mercury, read the headlines. Scientists had observed that high levels of mercury in wetland habitats had been altering the, quote, pairing behavior and reproductive success of a species of white ibis bird. This was just one of many recent examples of how pollutants leaking into the environment have been changing animals' hormone systems, traits, and behaviors, a story disproportionately sensationalized due to its tinge of salaciousness. In this case, it appears that some white ibises now prefer same-sex relationships over straight ones. One frequently circulated image shows a pair of male ibises strolling along the shoreline, looking very gay indeed. The tone of these stories is one of alarm. And it is surely alarming that human-made pollutants are altering the endocrine systems of other species. White ibises who do not breed with each other are more likely to go extinct, furthering the planet's reduction of its rapidly diminishing biodiversity. The gay birds represent yet another example from a long list of human behavior altering the planetary ecosystem in unexpected and damaging ways. Yet the consistent focus on the bird's sexually, quote, atypical behavior indicates another kind of alarmism too. Queerness here is presented as a direct result of the toxic environment, a freakish aberration from the bird's, quote, natural, straight orientation and egg-laying lives. Aligned with the toxic and the unnatural, the birds are anthropomorphized and their sexualities moralized according to human biases. Their gayness is taken as proof that the environment is poisonous. In an essay about ibises, health scientist Anne Pollock points out that seeing gay birds as emblematic of, quote, harm to our environment is a move steeped in heteronormativity, unquote. According to Pollock, commentators may couch their concern in terms of environmental awareness, but the sex lives of animals, and by proxy ours, is the underlying scare. Pollock argues further that if we're to anthropomorphize animals to the extent that we can even call them gay, we have to consider the possibility that their new sexual identities, assuming, probably wrongly, that their gayness is totally new rather than just something we haven't noticed before, are pleasant for them. Maybe the gay birds are enjoying their carefree, childless lifestyles. Perhaps some of these birds, like some humans, find aspects of reproduction a burden and have no desire to have babies. Quote, for biologists, reproductive success is often understood to be the final cause of human existence. Yet from whose perspective is the reproductive success the ultimate definition of success? Gods, Darwin's, ecologists, the animals? We can't know what satisfaction feels like to a bird, but we have to assume it isn't the same as the humans. More to the point, human desires differ among the species. Can't the birds? While she sympathizes with preservationist concerns and laments the possibility of ibis extinction, Pollock asks why some behaviors and some environments are deemed natural or unnatural, why human-caused climate change tends to get so much attention in circumstances like these, why bird sexuality is any of our business. It's true that the birds have not had a choice in the matter when it comes to their environmental pollution or hormone regulation. But then again, who does? Most people on the planet absorb a huge number of extremely toxic pollutants without prior consent too. Ideas about what is clean versus toxic, as in what is healthy versus unhealthy, and by extension good versus bad, are in constant flux. One day the newspaper touts the health benefits of chocolate and red wine in moderation, the next day it advises abstinence. One year progressive doctors tell you over-sanitizing your home will weaken your immune system. The next year a global pandemic arrives and television commercials implore you to constantly disinfect your hands and wear a mask. But in the US, not until 6 months of disinformation about proper protocol have already passed. While many are suspicious of non-round, non-red apples, others purposefully buy imperfect, ugly produce because they assume imperfection correlates with organic and healthy food. Opium is illegal in the US, but opiates are not only sanctioned, but gluttonously overproduced for big pharma's gain. With our incredibly leaky bodies and already mutated ecologies, we can hardly pretend there is a state of unmodified, unpolluted, sober nature in which animals like us could or should exist and bear fruit. There are also intoxicating effects to the toxic. Pollock says, yeah, maybe these birds are fucked up by their polluted environment, but it can be fun to be fucked up, unquote. What is recreation and what is poison is entirely a question of cultural attitude. A state of intoxication might be dangerous, but it might also be pleasurable, and there's nothing particularly aberrant about it. When it comes to sobriety as a default natural state, the last centuries have actually been a historical exception in the West. This is an image from a medieval manuscript, a little man hanging from the text, the main text of the book, who is being basically given what looks like a beer bong by his buddy. We can assume that this kind of drunkenness was not consistent every day, but you can remember that monasteries were often breweries, so monks drank mostly beer, for instance. Right, so throughout the Middle Ages, people drank beer or wine because most water wasn't potable at all. It was poisonous, toxic. Even if drunkenness doesn't fit into our current understanding of purity, many other chemically altered states do. Pharmacological substances are sanctioned when they contribute to productivity, wellness, or neurotypical normalcy. Nearly 20% of US Americans take antidepressants. Less fun probably than drinking all day and with a lot more side effects. noticeably. We're not talking about alcoholism. In response, pharma power has been reclaimed in opposition to conservative purity politics and endlessly shifting natural baselines. Consider the gleeful, if ironic, chemical liberation implied by Paul Preciado's 2008 book, Testo Junkie, describing his experience reimagining his body through use of testosterone. Somewhere between 20 and 30% of US Americans take a form of hormonal birth control. We can hardly pretend we aren't already constantly exploiting the potential advantages here. The 2018 Xenofeminist Manifesto's closing line sums it up. If nature is unjust, change nature. And here on this slide, I include a headline from the New York Times that says, a vaccine side effect leaves women wondering why isn't the pill safer? So this is just one of the most recent examples of people asking why the drugs that we take for granted are potentially very toxic. And if, for instance, vaccines have a much lower risk of blood clots than birth control that 20 to 30% of American women take, is that really something that we should accept? Despite their endocrinological metamorphoses and despite their declining reproductive rates, the gay ibises seem to be living long and healthy lives. Pollock likens their state to what some theorists have called queer sociality, where any moral, and in this case anthropomorphic, distinctions between toxic and safe, pure and artificial, chemically neutral and chemically enhanced, may be reclaimed and or rendered irrelevant through the sheer intoxicating nature of togetherness. These birds are still having an erotic and social life, if not a reproductive one, and that is still a life. Especially in an age of mass extinction, should not every form of life be celebrated and congratulated? And this is the slide of a white lady making a garden, which we can just assume is not a situation of queer sociality since she looks like this is hard to illustrate, so I'm giving you Archimboldo's The Tumnus Vegetable Man from 1590. The next text is hard to illustrate. In a landmark book of queer theory called No Future, Lee Edelman claims that politics as we know it operates on, quote, the presupposition that the body politic must survive, unquote, and that queerness provides an alternative political framework. As a term and a lived experience, queerness, quote, names the side of those not fighting for the children, the side outside the consensus by which all politics confirms the absolute value of reproductive futurism, unquote. And this is where queerness attains its ethical value. Like Edelman and many others, Pollock provokes us to rethink the capacity for intergenerational life as the telos of all life, but takes this further to suggest that this question applies even when it comes to other species. This is, of course, a provocation for humans to think anew about our own teleological drive toward intergenerational life in relation to all other life, especially when human activity is exactly what has fucked up the birds so much. Paradise Rot. Jenny Haval's short novel Paradise Rot from 2018 presents love as an ambivalent experience, both toxic and intoxicating. A young Norwegian exchange student, Johanna, moves to a beach town in Australia. Struggling to find housing, Johanna eventually moves in with Carol, a wafy Australian woman living in a strange house in a former brewery where beer was made. The brewery is disused, but doesn't seem to have stopped fermenting. Everything in the building is rotting. Mushrooms sprout from the bathtub grout, that's hard to say. Disintegrating apples overflow from the trash can. Insects circle. The decomposition is lively and sensorially overwhelming. The cheap walls built to divide the formerly cavernous space are paper thin, and Johanna can hear everything in the house, from water dripping to Carol peeing or even breathing. And Carol herself, increasingly fragile, sickly, somnambulistic, and clingy, seems to be decomposing into the stew. Soon after Johanna moves in, Carol starts sneaking into her bed at night. It's not clear whether Carol wants sex. She mainly seems to want someone to cling to, rub up against, cry with, and by dint of contact to assure herself that she exists. It's not clear whether Carol is entirely awake for these dreamlike encounters, which become increasingly erotic. The lovers soak into each other and the furniture, the floorboards. Carol wets the bed, pee soaking Johanna's clothes. Johanna gets her period and blood stains the sheets. In a state of what resembles chemical dependency, Johanna finds it harder and harder to leave the house or be away from Carol, who is constantly persuading her to stay home, who needs Johanna to feed her, take care of her, hold her, and touch her. Carol spends most of her time listlessly flipping through an erotic novel or passed out on the dank sofa. Johanna watches her, obsesses over her, loves her, despises her. The desire does not flow, but oozes between them, threatening to submerge Johanna. She struggles against the urge to become part of the damp house with its fungal occupants and its compost heap. Johanna's descriptions of their bodies indicate a troubling mingling. As when she considers the effect of Carol's touch on her skin, she says, quote, "Sometimes I was sure I could feel the little sprouts appear under the skin where she's breathed," unquote. Or the sensation of Carol slipping into her bed, she describes as, quote, "I felt the same soft skin melt against mine as I'd felt earlier, touching the mushroom cap. I didn't move, but let her envelop me," unquote. Ostensibly, Carol couldn't get Johanna pregnant, but Johanna is weirdly preoccupied with the risks of Carol penetrating her, to the extent that she feels like, quote, "anything can inseminate me now, anything can get into me," unquote. Her desire to be taken over is matched by her fear of being taken over from the inside out, impregnated or infected by something that decomposes her. She explains the threat in terms of impregnation, as if she has no other language at hand to explain the fear. This does not imply that somehow Thanks for letting me know. How is it now? I'll pick up. Johanna explains the threat in terms of impregnation, as if she has no other language to describe or explain her fear. This does not imply, I think, that somehow impregnation is at the root of sexual desire. The implication instead is that non-reproductive or even non-human penetration can be just as fulfilling, frightening, life-sustaining, life-destroying as any other kind. Because it can be both toxic and intoxicating, erotic love is ambivalent. One desires to be taken over, absorbed, enveloped, dissolved, decomposed. And one desires just as strongly to retain one's individual shape. For this reason, Anne Carson describes erotic love as a fundamentally ambivalent state in her 1986 book, Eros, the Bittersweet. As Carson puts it, the incursion of Eros invades the self, disturbing its homeostasis, and the self finds this both painful and pleasurable. It is only due to incursion, after all, that the self can even recognize the self as such. The self recognizes its boundaries and suddenly has to reckon with them. The lover has to ask, quote, "Once I have been mixed up in this way, who am I?" Desire changes the lover, unquote. Carson describes this change as both bitter and sweet, borrowing these terms from a fragment of poetry by the ancient Greek writer Sappho. "Eros once again limb loosener whirls me, sweet, bitter, impossible to fight off, creature stealing up." Where others have translated Sappho's term glukuprikon as the colloquial bittersweet, Carson translates the word, itself a neologism Sappho likely invented, as sweet bitter. For Sappho, Carson argues, first the sweetness of love intoxicates, and then its bitterness signals its potential toxicity. First delicious, then repellent, then both. Because of this vacillation, Carson calls the word sweet bitter, glukuprikon, a sticky one, two opposing words for opposing sensations stuck together. Being in love is a sticky place. One wants to stay and one wants to escape, one wants to open and one wants to close. According to Carson, the boundary disintegrating experience of erotic love is akin to the experience of encountering the written word. And here is a slide with some pictures of fragments of poetry from Sappho. We only have fragments. She was writing in the 6th century BCE, so it's lucky that even these survived, but it indicates the fragmentary nature of the written word through history in a whole new way when we think that we only have these fragments that we have to piece together and kind of fill in the blanks. Carson explains that reading requires something particular of the reader's mind and does something particular to it. In early oral cultures where sound is the primary mode of communication, information enters and exits consciousness in a fluid way, requiring less focused concentration than looking does, and much less concentration than reading does. But reading requires one to block out the other senses to concentrate. A communication system based on literacy demands visual focus and an exercise of self-control. And when written, information becomes a fixed entity rather than flexible, open-ended, alive, updatable. In an oral culture, whatever gets committed to memory and repeated might be incorporated eventually into a story. But a written story is alienated from the storyteller, converted into the corpus of text rather than carried within the body of the person who speaks. Literacy changes the way people relate to one another. Per Carson, quote, oral cultures and literate cultures do not think, perceive, or fall in love in the same way. Letters compose words, which in turn compose letters that lovers can send across vast distances, bridging space and time. Carson recounts numerous ancient stories of lovers separated by distance but bridged by the written word. It is letters that pose the dilemma of absent presence for lover and beloved, unquote. Like the space between letters, the space between lovers is necessary to make meaning from their union. Without the gap, there is no longing to be felt and no meaning to be made. Texts require boundaries, selves require boundaries. Only when a boundary materializes can it become a site for transgression. And this slide is a very recent image of a human cell, one of the best images we have of mitochondria. And I just find it very beautiful and also very odd in the way that it looks like a infrastructures image and the way that the boundaries are drawn between sections of the cell. In a society of the written word, Eros is figured as a threat. If cells have membranes separating, individuating, and protecting an individual from the outside, the dissolution of the self that is occasioned by, demanded by, love becomes frightening. Love stories in the Western tradition tend to be written along a common arc, at least the ones that Carson writes about. The lover is taken over by the object of desire, maybe even becoming incapacitated, crazy, or desperate. Cupid's arrow jabs the skin and renders the lover helpless, that is to say, no longer in control. Under thrall of an outside force, invaded, body snatched. It feels bitter, it feels sweet. Your story begins the moment Eros enters you, Carson explains. She writes, quote, that incursion is the biggest risk of your life. How you handle it is an index of the quality, wisdom, and decorum of the things inside you. As you handle it, you come in contact with what is inside you in a sudden and startling way, unquote. The lover, like the writer, reaches toward a future fiction when two become one, or three become one, or four become one. Lover and beloved, writer and reader, trying to bridge an impossible gap to overcome the boundary between subjectivities, which itself creates the possibility for the pleasure of its transgression. Yet if the boundary were truly dissolved, the site of desire would be erased. The Western story of desire, writes Carson, is premised on self-enclosure and love's subsequent assault on the history of the self. The history of self-enclosure could also be told in political and economic terms. As theorists like Barbara Ehrenreich, Deirdre English, and Silvia Federici have explained at length, the delimitation and privatization of especially the female body occurred simultaneously with the expropriation, delimitation, and privatization of common land and resources throughout the High and Late Middle Ages. An extractive capitalist system requires that, like the natural world, bodies become resources, which requires creating boundaries between individuals. So here is a zoom out and a close-up from a manuscript, which is, you can see there is some pretty aggressive defense of land space by this man who looks like Cupid shooting an arrow into a farmer who has ostensibly taken over someone else's land. And you can see the castle beyond, which is clearly the enclosure of private wealth mirrored in the enclosure of common land. Individuals can then be combined into discrete family units, which requires creating boundaries between, further enclosed microeconomies whose productive labor is extracted and whose reproductive labor is then made invisible. In the words of Erica Lagalis, quote, "Just as land, air, and water must first be enclosed as resources before the capitalist may profit from the commodities they are then used to produce, so were women enclosed as reduced to mere bodies, insofar as it served to enforce the logic of private property, wage work, and the transformation of women into reproducers of labor," unquote. This image is a still from a video from 2019 by the artist Rachel Rose, which is titled Enclosure, and which follows a female character with some magical properties as paper becomes money and as land becomes privatized. And here's another still from that movie, which I think is quite beautiful. Taken together, Carson's historical understanding of self-enclosure as the premise for erotic love and the story of self-enclosure as the premise for capitalism suggests that to transgress one of these boundaries may be to transgress the other. It suggests, in the words of Alain Badiou, quote, "a kind of secret resonance," unquote, between the intensely erotic and the intensely political, between the body and the body politic. If, as Lee Edelman writes, politics itself is built on the notion of a self-perpetuating body politic that must survive by reproducing itself, having sex, having babies, then non-reproductive, quote, "queer oppositionality," unquote, fundamentally challenges the structural determinants of politics as such. Assuming the structural determinants of the self-perpetuating body politic include those of sex and gender among humans, they must also include notions like human, non-human, living and non-living. A queer oppositionality must transcend structural determinants within the category humanity. But to do so, it may need to disrupt the essentialisms and enclosures pertaining to the category of species itself. Reproduction is a feminized practice, but trying to degender or distribute that work among all humans could only essentialize, enclose it further. Uncoupling the erotic from the reproductive is not enough either. Another set of enclosures within and around humanity simply arise. A queer oppositionality to come would not simply be degendered, but despecies. To move beyond human, non-human hierarchies and distinctions, the oppositionality against all essentialisms that is necessary for political antagonism must be ecologically distributed. Bad Graft. Karen Russell's 2014 short story, The Bad Graft, is about an unwanted, unexpected, erotic interspecies incursion. The story opens as a young man and young woman embark on a runaway road trip through the US-American Southwest. They've eloped with nothing but a car and some cash, driving toward the great unknown. Entirely wrapped up in each other and their love, they find the danger of the futurelessness exciting enough to overcome the impracticality of it all. Exhaustion and disorientation begin to set in as the gas and the money run low. They stop when they finally reach the only destination they've agreed upon, Joshua Tree National Park in California. This is a picture of the Joshua trees. A park ranger stops their car to notify them that they have luckily arrived at a golden ecological moment. Their visit has coincided with a tremendous blossoming, one that is occurring all over the Southwest. Quote, "Highly erotic," the ranger says with his creepy bachelor smile. A record number of greenish-white flowers have erupted out of the Joshuas. Pineapple huge, they crown every branch. So fertile is this hot desert, usually dry and barren, it seems as if it's bloomed just for their arrival. The, quote, orgy of the Joshua tree's pollen and the pollinating moths with whom they have a symbiotic relation is so great that it overwhelms the couple as they approach what they call the hilariously alien trees. Overcome by the sight, suddenly the girl, the narrator calls her the girl, feels a stabbing pain in her finger. One of the tree's trillions of tiny spines has pierced her hand. The narration zooms in as the pollen from the plant enters her body through the wound and mingles with the blood. The narrator calls this moment the leap, the instant at which one species crosses over, attempting to mate with another. The pollination in this case is a non-consensual accident. The girl soon feels a heat pulsing in her abdomen like cramps, which then crawls up her spine. She had been intoxicated by witnessing the pollen storm, but as soon as the molecule crosses her body's threshold, it becomes immediately toxic. Following this mismatched alien incursion, the girl's body becomes a kind of resentful host for the equally resentful plant. The plant's perspective is given a voice at times. It says, quote, "I survived my leap. I was not annihilated, whatever I was," unquote. Although the plant's sense of self is mixed up by the crossing, at first it is simply elated it has survived. But the joy at having survived is quickly overtaken by frustration. Its needs and desires to put down roots in the desert and survive 1,000 years without moving are completely incompatible with those of its new mobile female body. The girl is likewise overcome by an immunological response to her accidental implantation, becoming restless and physically unwell. This image is still from the movie Annihilation, made by Alex Garland, which is based off of a trilogy by Jack Vandermeer called the Southern Reach trilogy, in which the narrator becomes similarly implanted by an alien species and begins to turn into one. The plant's desires begin to impress themselves onto the girl in Russell's stories. The girl is overcome with irresistible urges to be outside, to lay flat on the ground and be alone. Her boyfriend, meanwhile, has no clue that he is now party to a love triangle. All that he perceives, says Russell, is that his girlfriend is acting very strangely. The plant has clearly penetrated her more completely than her boyfriend ever could, but it's not as if she tries very hard to explain anything to him. The plant learns to enjoy, or at least to tolerate, some of the sensations it gains through the girl's sensory apparatus, the sight of colors, the ability to move its limbs. Sometimes it feels intoxicated by the possibilities. In turn, sometimes she feels intoxicated by its presence. Girl and plant reach an uneasy symbiosis as her hormonal cycles and its annual cycles overlap in different ways, sometimes allowing them to coexist, sometimes forcing them to battle for dominance within a single body. Her relationship with her boyfriend changes and disintegrates, as much from the strangeness of her behavior as from the fact that she is not so passionate about him anymore, now that she is passionate about other things. She is forever enthralled to her competing desires. Stay whole, be taken over completely. The plant inside her feels somewhat the same. The gift. The poet Lewis Hyde asks, if we open ourselves to love, will love come in return or poison? Will new identity appear, or the dead end death that leaves a restless soul? Unquote. In his book called The Gift, first published in 1983, Hyde looks to literature for descriptions of love's risk and reward. If love decomposes the self's boundaries, will it revivify the self as well? What forms of penetration, if any, does love require? As a case study of a life entirely open, perhaps too open, to the incursions of love, Hyde turns to the poet Walt Whitman, weaving fragments of Whitman's poetry into a biographical account of Whitman's many loves. I have allergies, which is appropriate to this talk, actually, I'm realizing, excuse me. Whitman was romantically frustrated for most of his life. He had a number of relationships with other men that, despite his longing, never amounted to the subsumption of self and other that his poems suggest he so fervently desired. He found solace, joy, and reciprocity in many other places, notably a hospital for wounded Civil War veterans, where he spent months at a time tending to the patients. But mainly throughout his life, he found rapturous self-dissolution in nature, the love of which overtook him, and the love of which forms the basis for the writing he's best known for. In many poems, Whitman expresses a continual desire to be penetrated by the natural world, to be overgrown by plants, to become compost for the regeneration of life, human and non-human alike. In one poem, first called Poem of Wonder at the Resurrection of Wheat, and later retitled This Compost, Whitman marvels at the processes of decay and purification. The ground, which received so many of the soldiers he watched die, wounded and sick and corrupted as their bodies were, has converted them into raw material for fresh life, grass that cradles the living who walk upon it. Whitman exults chemistry, that the winds are not really infectious, that when I recline on the grass, I do not catch any disease, though probably every spear of grass rises out of what was once a catching disease. Whitman's encounters with soil and grass are eternally sexy. His desire for the earth is erotically charged, precisely because it is a struggle with boundaries and separations. Because the earth erodes these distinctions through rot and regeneration. As for many mystics, and Whitman was certainly a mystic, the non-human world provides for Whitman a philosophical and aesthetic mode or encounter, which served as a model for understanding and transcending anthropocentric erotics. Hyde writes, quote, Whitman does not deny his hesitancy and fear, but in the end he opens the skin, accepting what is poison to particular identity so as to receive a higher sweetness for the durable self, unquote. This is a piece of art by Matilda Roussel called Lives of Grass, which is a play on Whitman's famous book, Leaves of Grass, and is really a growing figure, like there's real grass growing out of this figure. This compost is born of Whitman's hesitancy when it comes to human relationships. But, quote, in the poem at least, Whitman resolves his hesitancy by fixing his eye on the give and take of vegetable life, in which the earth grows such sweet things out of such corruptions. In apparent decay, the man of faith recognizes the compost of new life, unquote. That was from Hyde. Some readers have interpreted Whitman's exaltations on nature as a last resort necessity of a man who could not find the fulfillment of Eros in his life. But Hyde interprets Whitman's nature worship as a kind of erotic relationship beyond what can be accounted for by any single human relationship. Whitman's work and life embody an erotic give and take, risk and reward that disregards or transcends species. Perhaps Whitman was so desirous of incursion that his desire could not be contained by the reductive set of human options. Hyde's extensive writing on Whitman forms a large section of the book, The Gift, the thesis of which is that the creative act, artistic creation, is fundamentally an act of generosity, which may be accounted for by commodity systems such as the market economy, but which forever evade total capture by those systems. Hyde makes some dubious sojourns into gift theory and anthropological surveys of cultures with gift-giving economies, and analyzes the ways that gifts have today been commodified and funneled through philanthropic systems. Yet despite the function of the gift in a given time and place, Hyde maintains that the gift is fundamentally unique in that its value always increases as it circulates. The gift contains within it, quote, the mystery of things that increase as they perish, unquote, just like compost. The gift may degrade, but it holds potential for eternal growth. This is another still from Rachel Rosa's video, Enclosure. In Whitman, Hyde seeks evidence of a life that was all gift. He portrays Whitman as a person whose love, including his erotic desire, became ecologically distributed. Poetry was his form of gift. Like a gift, the poem does not belong to anyone, ultimately. Poems, like bodies, are, quote, independent of intentions and authors. Their boundaries materialize in social interaction, unquote, as Donna Haraway writes. For this reason, the poem is a non-reproductive yet highly erotic gift. One might use the poem gift to hypothesize a world where other resources grow as they circulate too, where regeneration of all forms are considered valuable forms of meaning making, and where erotic experiences are untethered from both value production and biological reproduction. Anal Utopia. Preciado published an essay in 2009 called Anal Terror. The text's argument is that patriarchal capitalism emerged through centuries-long process of anal castration, the denial or sealing up of any orifice that could not be reduced to sexual or reproductive functions, especially the orifice through which compost exits the body and enters the earth, the anus. In another historical process of corporeal enclosure, Preciado writes, quote, "It was necessary to close up the anus to sublimate pansexual desire, transforming it into the social bond, just as it was necessary to enclose the commons to mark out private property," unquote. He goes on, "To close up the anus so that the sexual energy that could flow through it would become honorable and healthy male camaraderie, linguistic exchange, communication, media, advertising, and capital," unquote. To borrow Hyde's terms, to close the anus is to restrict the movement of the gift, which accrues rather than loses value as it exits the body and becomes independent of the self. Here is another medieval manuscript, Marginalia, which is the drawings around the central text. Many of them are very playful, as this one is. Here you can see some flourishes exiting from a disembodied ass and legs of somebody, which I just think suggests in previous times there were different relations to orifices as generative, regenerative, funny, gross, whatever. So in Preciado's terms, the anus is threatening to patriarchal capitalism precisely because it is sexy and reproductive, as long as anal sex is understood as sex and shit is understood as manure from which new life grows. That new life is not, at least in the first stage, human life. The worldview required to uncastrate the anus to reach toward what Preciado calls an anal utopia would require one to consider non-human species as part of an ecosystem in which shit is essential food rather than toxic waste. Quote, "The community of closed anuses is shored up with dumb columns made of families with their anally castrated father and their hollow viscera mother. The kids with castrated anuses built a community they called city, state, nation," unquote. This community is limited not only to those whose anuses are closed, but to those who see the telos of all life as capital production and biological reproduction. This is another manuscript. I don't have the dates on these, but I can send them to anybody who would like to look at them further. This is a woman growing from a flower blossom. Where would all the erotic energy go in the anal utopia? If all orifices were understood to be potentially erotic, the nostrils, the pores of the skin, and all orifices were seen as reproductive, if productivity was beside the point, if bodies did not have, quote, outsides and insides, marking zones of privilege and abject zones, if desire were not seen as a reserve of truth, but rather, quote, an artifact that is culturally constructed, modeled by social violence, incentives, and rewards, but also by fear of exclusion, unquote. If desire were no longer a marker of identity, by which one is made queer or femme or whatever else, if desire were instead seen as, quote, an arbitrary slice of an uninterrupted and polyvocal flow, unquote, if an interpenetration were understood as a constant fact rather than a means to a reproductive end, erotic energy is made political by being made ecological. Sophie Lewis, author of the book Full Surrogacy Now, reaches toward anal utopia through the concept of surrogacy and gestation as a shared process. She names the work of gestation what it is, labor, and she traces the now prevalent economy of surrogate motherhood labor, by which women are paid to carry babies on behalf of others. The classism and racism of a system that treats women's bodies as machines for hire is explicit when it comes to the surrogacy economy, But as Lewis identifies, these are inherent in gestational politics across the board. The technological capability that has allowed the labor of gestation to be outsourced has built upon existing systems of exploitation. Lewis proposes a rather utopian alternative, a new gestational politics based on sharing responsibilities as opposed to outsourcing them. And here the slide makes a bit of a leap, but it's one of my favorite examples of shared responsibility when there was an autonomous zone sort of temporarily and not very permanently, I guess. It just lasted a very short time. There was an autonomous zone set up in Seattle following the insurrection last year or in the midst of it. And the first thing they did in the autonomous zone was to build a community garden, which was also intended to be a safe space and provide food for the unhoused. Anyway, this is another image of the garden and this idea of it being a specific place of enclosure that is completely different from the processes of enclosure that we are familiar with. For Sophie Lewis, this entails abolishing the family unit, that is gestational politics, involve abolishing the family unit in its current formation, extending the idea of surrogacy beyond a biological process into a social and political act of caretaking after a baby is born and long after. In an interview, Lewis says, quote, "If everything is surrogacy, the whole question of original or natural relationships falls by the wayside. In that sense, what surrogacy means is standing in for one another, caring for one another, making one another. It's a word to describe the very actual but also utopian fact that we are the makers of one another and we can learn to act like it," unquote. Regardless of what family or non-family structures one advocates for or personally desires, because desire matters, it is true that people are the makers of one another and also the makers and the product of trillions of other species. We gestate and are gestated by them. People co-create the atmosphere and we can learn to act like it. So I have about one section left and a little over my estimated time, but it should be about 5-something minutes more. Back to plants. Interpenetration is necessary for all life. This, writes Emmanuel Kochia, is a lesson taught best by plants. In the book, The Life of Plants, Kochia argues that plants are, quote, the paradigm of immersion in that they are contiguous with their environments. One cannot separate the plant, neither physically nor metaphysically, from the world that accommodates it, unquote. The plant draws nutrients from its immediate access to earth, air, and sun, and in doing so, it produces the conditions, the literal environmental necessities of nutrients and minerals for all life, which rots and regrows. Quote, all the forms capable of photosynthesis are domestic titans that do not need violence to found new worlds. I love the term domestic titans. By new worlds, Kochia means new ecosystems, but also new cosmologies, ways of explaining where life comes from and what it is for. Kochia writes, quote, plants then allow us to understand that immersion is not a simple spatial determination. To be immersed is not reducible to finding oneself in something that surrounds and penetrates us, unquote. Immersion is not one way, but rather a type of mutual co-penetration, continuous and constant. That is to say that, as he puts it, quote, for there to be immersion, subject and environment have to actively penetrate each other. Otherwise, one would speak simply of juxtaposition or contiguity between two bodies touching at their extremities, unquote. A world is forged through co-penetration. Immersion is always reciprocal. To try to seal up the anus is not only sad, but futile. It pretends penetration is one way and directional. Co-penetration is intoxicating. Trying to prevent it is truly toxic. This is a still from the movie Any When by Philip Perreno from 2016. On the back cover of the 2019 English edition of Kochia's book, Bruno Latour gives a somewhat backhanded endorsement. Latour says, back to animals, back to mushrooms, and now back to plants. Latour is referring to the recent spate of popular writing on the non-human world, the sometimes romanticized, quote, post-Anthropocene turn in nature to nature in the arts and humanities. The reasons for the trend are obvious. Humans have fucked up the planet, exalting our own presence, progress, and needs for centuries. And now we have no choice but to attend to what we've overlooked and destroyed. For a while, back to land was the goal. Kombucha on tap, probiotics, fecal transplants, paleo diets, craft breweries. Don't clean your children, dirt is natural, replenish your gut. Humans aren't meant to eat reprocessed foods. This is just an example of something I was recently targeted advertised, probably because I was preparing this talk. So these are personalized probiotics. The pandemic prompted a rapid reversal. Fastidious hygiene, disinfection, quarantine, separation. Nature was benevolent, then nature became the enemy. Either way, the achievement of health here is premised on the ability to control what enters and exits the body's borders. Although the variables may change, the border remains. This is far from progress towards the anal utopia Preciado asked for. It is simply the ongoing redefinition of purity and toxicity according to new terms. This is another still from Annihilation. There can be no direct reversal of the Anthropocene and its processes of enclosure. Symbiosis cannot be recreated where it has been lost. An ecosystem that has lost crucial elements has already adapted to the changes to the extent that simply re-adding these lost elements may even be harmful instead of restorative. There are toxic materials in the soil and air. Corporations and governments have put them there. And this is now the baseline. There is a dire need for preservation and conservation, but there is nothing to go back to. Anyway, to go back to nature would simply require more women's work. Essentialisms about feminine porosity and the resulting kinship with the natural world are well known. The feminized body, like feminized nature, was enclosed precisely so it could be penetrated, so it could do the work of penetration. And here we have a classic man observing his landscape, Caspar David Friedrich from the 1800s, which I present as an oppositional image to what I'm talking about. On the other hand, girls own the void, as the artist Audrey Wallen's beloved meme proclaims, because girls have learned how to bottom, how to claim the hollow viscera, which Preciado calls it. But everyone's got holes. Breathing is reproductive. It births the atmosphere. Shit is reproductive. It births the atmosphere. Dying is reproductive. It births the atmosphere. No amount of disintegration or porousness makes people any less. One can remain human while being mixed up, because to be human is to be mixed up. Kochia writes that, quote, if things form a world, it is because they mix without losing their identity, unquote. Recalling Carson, the same could be said of love. You find yourself when you lose yourself in it. Although it is described in terms of choice and desire, interpenetration is an ecological fact. To encounter Eros on the species level will entail all the risk and joy, death and regeneration, intoxication and toxicity that human erotic love entails. As vegetable life has the chemistry of compost, Hyde writes, we humans may clean our animal blood through the chemistry of love. This previous slide was a work called Hollow Biont by the artist Yana Sutella from 2018, where outer space becomes part of a person's inner world. And this following slide is from another work by her called Gut Machine Poetry, in which fermenting systems create textual systems that are then represented in a video. In a text ostensibly offering advice to young writers, Otessa Moshfegh likens the process of writing to the process of self-fertilization, producing and feeding off of her own compost. She says that, quote, in writing, I often think about how to shit. What kind of stink do I want to make in the world? My new shit becomes the shit I eat. I learn by digesting my own delusions. It's often very disgusting, unquote. Forget species perpetuation. In this model, writing is reproductive and its product is a circulable, compostable, regenerative gift. In this model, your gut enzymes are equal partners in your reproductive labor. In this model, writing, like fucking, like shitting, requires no femme fertility, only fertilizer. Working and loving in this way may be very disgusting. It may also be very intoxicating. And now I will end with a picture of a mushroom that I grew during quarantine in my house, and an image from my local community garden where I am on compost duty. And that's the end. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. Such a great talk. Let's see each other in 15 minutes, so 8:10. And thanks for the lecture.